My name is Colonel Elena Bennett, and for 3 years, my mother-in-law believed I was nothing more than a paperwork clerk who played soldier on weekends. She used to smirk every time I mentioned work. She'd say things like, "Oh, Elena has her little army job." She said it in front of guests. She said it in front of my husband. She even said it in front of our daughter. I let her believe it, because the truth was classified, and honestly, I didn't think I owed her an explanation. But on the day my husband's freedom was on the line, standing in a courtroom that could have destroyed our family, she looked at me and said, "You're finished." She laughed. She actually laughed, right there in the hallway, in front of the lawyers, in front of the bailiff. 90 seconds later, the judge walked in, looked directly at me, and said, "Good morning, Colonel." My mother-in-law's smile did not just fade. It froze on her face like she'd been slapped. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, is that I hadn't just worn the uniform. For 11 years, I had prosecuted military crimes. I had put people away for far less than what was happening in that courtroom. And that day, I was about to prove it. Let me take you back 2 years, before any of this happened. I married my husband, David, 5 years ago. His mother, Carol, never approved of me. Not because of anything I did, but because of what I didn't do. I didn't come from money. I didn't have a respectable desk job. In her eyes, working in the military legal system was somewhere between a hobby and an embarrassment. What Carol never asked, not once, was what I actually did in the military. She assumed. She assumed I filed papers. She assumed I answered phones. And every time I tried to correct her, she'd wave her hand and change the subject, like my career was too boring to discuss. So I stopped explaining. I let her believe whatever made her comfortable. David used to apologize for her. "She's old-fashioned," he'd say. "She doesn't mean it." I told him it was fine. I told myself the same thing. What Carol didn't know was this. I had spent over a decade as a judge advocate, a military prosecutor. I had handled fraud cases, assault cases, cases involving betrayal of trust at the highest levels. I had stood in courtrooms far more intense than any civilian court, and I had never lost. I kept that history quiet, not out of shame, but out of peace. Some battles aren't worth fighting at the dinner table, but peace has a limit. And Carol was about to push me past mine. It started with David's business. 2 years ago, he partnered with his cousin, Marcus, to launch a small logistics company. Carol adored Marcus. To her, he could do no wrong. Meanwhile, she treated David, her own son, like he was lucky to be included. Slowly, things started disappearing. Missing invoices. Strange transfers. David noticed the numbers didn't add up, but every time he raised concerns, Carol accused him of being paranoid, of not trusting family. I stayed quiet at first. This wasn't my business, literally. But then Marcus filed a criminal complaint accusing David of embezzlement, of stealing from the company he co-founded. Carol didn't hesitate. She believed her nephew over her own son in less than a day. "You always thought you were better than us," she told David over the phone, loud enough that I could hear it from across the room. "Now everyone will see what you really are." David sat in our kitchen that night, pale, shaking, facing possible charges, facing a trial, facing the collapse of everything he'd built. And Carol? She told him, flatly, "Don't expect me to sit in that courtroom for you." That was the moment I stopped being quiet. The court date arrived faster than expected. David needed representation, but more than that, he needed someone who understood how fabricated financial cases actually get built and how they get torn apart. I offered to help. Not as his wife, as someone who understood the system. Carol laughed at me, right in our living room. "What exactly are you going to do, Elena?" "Bring your little binder," she said, sipping her tea like this was entertainment. "This is a real courtroom. Real lawyers. Real consequences." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply asked her one question. "Are you coming to support your son or not?" She looked at David, then at me, and said the words that would haunt her by the end of that week. "He made his bed. I'm not showing up to watch him lose." David begged her. I watched a grown man ask his own mother for 5 minutes of loyalty and watched her refuse. The morning of the hearing, Carol did show up. Not for David. She came to make sure I didn't embarrass the family further, as she put it. She wanted a front row seat to what she assumed would be our downfall. She had no idea she was about to witness the opposite. While Carol assumed I was doing nothing, I had spent every night for 2 weeks pulling apart Marcus's financial claims. I requested the original transaction records. I cross-referenced dates. I found inconsistencies that any trained investigator would recognize immediately. Transfers logged after the supposed theft, signatures that didn't match banking patterns, timestamps that placed Marcus, not David, at the source of the missing funds. I built the case the way I built every case in uniform, methodically, without emotion, without revenge as the goal. Only truth. I didn't tell Carol any of this. I didn't tell her about my rank. I didn't tell her about the courts-martial I had led, the criminals I had convicted, the reputation I had built long before she ever met me. I let her keep laughing, because I know something Carol never understood. The people who talk the loudest before a fight are usually the ones who've never actually seen one. The morning of the hearing, David was terrified. His hands wouldn't stop shaking as we walked toward the courthouse steps. Carol stood off to the side, arms crossed, refusing to walk with us. "Good luck," she said coldly. "You'll need it." Inside, the prosecutor, hired by Marcus's family, laid out their case with false confidence. They expected an easy win. They expected David to fold. Then it was my turn. I stood, straightened my blazer, and requested permission to submit evidence as a certified legal representative. The opposing lawyer scoffed, assuming I was bluffing. That's when the judge looked down at my submitted credentials, my full military legal record, and paused. He looked up. Not at David. At me. "Colonel Bennett," he said, "it's an honor to have you in my courtroom again." The room went silent. I turned, just briefly, toward the back row, where Carol sat, her mocking smile gone, her face pale as she realized the little army job she'd humiliated for years belonged to a woman who had prosecuted crimes far more serious than a smug family betrayal. Then I turned back to the judge and got to work. Piece by piece, I laid out the evidence. The manipulated timestamps. The transfers that proved Marcus, not David, had misused company funds. The signatures altered just enough to fool someone who wasn't trained to notice, but not nearly enough to fool me. Within 40 minutes, the airtight case against David had completely fallen apart. The judge dismissed the charges. Not reduced. Dismissed. Marcus was later formally investigated for his own conduct, the very crime he tried to pin on David. As we walked out of the courtroom, David hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Relief poured out of him like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. Carol stood frozen by the exit. For the first time in 5 years, she didn't have a single sharp word to say. Finally, quietly, she asked, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I looked at her, not with anger, but with something closer to pity. "You never asked," I said. "You only assumed." She opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to argue. In the weeks that followed, Carol changed. Not overnight, not dramatically, but she stopped mocking what she didn't understand. She started asking real questions instead of making careless assumptions. It wasn't a fairy tale transformation, but it was honest progress, and for our family that was enough. As for me, I didn't need her apology to feel whole. I already knew who I was, long before she ever doubted me. Here's what I've learned. Some people will judge your worth based on what they can see on the surface, a job title, a soft voice, a quiet nature. They mistake silence for weakness. They mistake patience for permission to disrespect you. But real strength doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't beg to be believed. It simply waits, and when the moment comes, it speaks for itself. I didn't walk into that courtroom to prove Carol wrong. I walked in to save my husband. Her humiliation wasn't my goal. It was simply the truth catching up to her assumptions. So if someone underestimates you today, at work, at home, in your own family, don't waste your energy convincing them. Just keep showing up. Keep doing the work. Because one day, the truth will introduce itself, and you won't need to say a single word. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better? Subscribe for more stories about truth, justice, and the quiet strength that wins in the end.